Legal Podcast Network. Okay, let's talk about this birthright citizenship first. The Supreme Court will decide if President Trump's attempt to end birthright citizenship with an executive order is constitutional. We're talking about the 14th Amendment here. That's the focus here in particular. So let's put that up on the screen if we have. There's one particular part that says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. But the president's team argues this point.
Our primary contention is that the citizenship clause related to the children of former slaves, not to illegal aliens who weren't even present as a discrete class at that time.
Elise, walk us through what's at stake here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot at stake here, right? Because you got to imagine every individual born in this country to parents who are either here illegally or on a temporary status that can even be lawful visas would no longer have citizenship automatically conferred upon them. So this is a very high stakes case. I think what's important is, we hear John Sauer, that's the Solicitor General, saying, no, this was really about slavery. But that flies in the face of the plain text of this constitutional amendment. There have been other lower court cases, one out of New Hampshire, for instance, that said that is not the plain reading of the text. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the Supreme Court considers this case, even with that historical framework, given the language of that text.
Okay, so there's another case that we want to talk about here. That's before the Supreme Court, redistricting in Louisiana, Mike. And if their new maps violated the Voting Rights Act, for this one, Justice Brett Kavanaugh seems to be key, and the ruling could erode the Voting Rights Act. What's your read on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is another big case that's going to be before the Supreme Court in 2026. And, we've already seen it on the ballot in California with Prop 50. We've already seen what Texas has done with this maps. Now we're seeing this case with respect to Louisiana. I would defer to the lawyer on this, on what she expects. But from a redistricting perspective, this is going to be front and center for the Supreme Court in 2026 because we have elections that are going to be consequential. And so we're going to have expedited rulings on these things because of primaries that are going to start to happen in some of these states. And we need to get some clarity on what we're going to have here with respect to all of this, because it's being challenged.
It's going to be front and center for voters as well. Elise, what's your take on it?
I mean, it's hard to guess what the Supreme Court is going to do. I mean, they've already narrowed voting rights. We know that. So I think it's fair to say that, the Voting Rights Act is on the chopping block. Here in the Louisiana case, we have two districts that are primarily African-American. That's what the current map shows. And, the Voting Rights Act was meant to protect the rights of minority voters. And what they're saying here is if the map is ultimately reversed, it could potentially disenfranchise those minority voters because they wouldn't have their own voice heard at the ballot. So very high stakes, very high stakes.
And I was going to say, we've seen a case like this before with Harris County in Texas. We saw some allegations, I believe it was during the 22 midterms or 24, where voting locations started to close early, precincts started to close early, and there were some challenges legally down there. And it's because of why? The disenfranchisement of voters, African Americans, Latinos, that make up a lot of Harris County outside of Houston. So we've seen challenges like this, to Elisa's point. This is eroding the very fabric of allowing voters, especially ones that look like Elise and I, to go out there to the ballot box and express their vote.
Also, one of the larger topics for 2025 was President Trump's tariffs, right? That is going to be hitting the Supreme Court as well. The Trump administration arguing that a 1977 law that grants the president economic powers to address emergencies give him broad power to levy these tariffs. What would a win or loss mean for the president? Elise?
Again, very high stakes. This entire term is very high stakes, and it's really testing the bounds of presidential power. So here, the legal question is whether or not the president exceeded his authority under that statute. Now, the Supreme Court has seemed a little bit, not suspicious, but they have asked questions indicating that they think that this might have gone too far. Right, that there is a check on the executive, because this is really a separations of powers issue. This is really the tariffs are really
not the first time that the Supreme Court has ruled on separation of powers issues.
Correct, but this Supreme Court has actually expanded the executive branch. But here they seem to be signaling that they might go the other way and really recognize Congress's power, who really has the power over the tariff. And so the stakes are high, because if this is ultimately reversed, if the Trump administration is found to have exceeded their authority here, we could be talking about billions of dollars of potential refunds from all of these tariffs that have been levied. On the other hand, if the Trump administration prevails, then that has just given just extraordinary economic power to the president that should belong with Congress.
Mike, what consequences do you see happening on either side of that coin?
I mean, it's the politics game that's being played in D.C., right? When is Congress going to actually legislate and do their job and put the check on the executive branch? And that's what's at stake, like Elise just mentioned, in this case. In terms of tariffs overall, remember, tariffs are a tax, everybody out there, okay? I hope the administration's watching this on New Year's Day. So we're going to see how the court ends up ruling on this. But it is interesting to see that you mentioned exactly the core of the case, which is truly the separation of power and letting the executive branch just have carte blanche authority, which is what I've heard from legal scholars like yourself and others that have mentioned about the way the Supreme Court has ruled with regard to this. And again, the administration is using older legislation, little tricks. You know, we got the War Powers Act that was invoked with the immigration stuff. Now we've got this 1977 one that's no one knows about except if you're a legal beagle. So we're going to see if all of these things, how they're tested by the Supreme Court. She's right. Elisa's right. This is the most consequential term probably for the court on dockets and cases.
Not the only thing on Supreme Court's docket that talks about President Trump's powers. Let's talk about his power over independent agencies as well. The Supreme Court seems ready to side with President Trump in this case and expanding his power over independent agencies. But there is an issue whether the president can fire 2 federal trade commissioners. A favorable ruling could give the president the power to remove political appointees, right, at will. What are the broader implications of giving the president those expanded powers?
Well, I mean, again, back to the question of separations of power. The executive branch is in charge of these agencies. Keep me honest here, at least. So the president has talked about where he fired that commissioner, and then obviously the lower courts, I think, ruled that she had to be reinstated back. So where does the executive branch's power lie versus where it's something where the president is told, no, you can't do that. That is outside of your jurisdiction. This is another case that will set the precedent, I think, going forward for future presidents on how they delegate and how they hire people in some of these roles and how these agencies function. I mean, keep me honest here, at least. I think it's the core issue as you're seeing the core through line through some of these cases that are going to be before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's whether there's a check on executive power. So there's really 2 consequential cases here. There's one with Lisa Cook, that she's on the Fed Reserve, and then there's this other case, Trump v. Slaughter, where you have the person from the FTC who is fired. So the Slaughter case is testing precedent that was set in a case called Humphrey's Executor, which basically means that there has to be certain criteria met before you remove someone from a federal agency. It seems like the court might be poised to overturn that precedent, although, again, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm very careful with these predictions.
If only we all did.
If only we all did.
That was also in the 1930s, right, if I'm not mistaken?
It's a very old case, I think it's 90 years old. Yeah. Then contrast that with Trump v. Cook, where we have the Fed Reserve, who has extraordinary independent powers. They have really been set up to be an independent agency because they shape monetary policy. So the stakes in that case are actually higher than the other case, because if a president can remove a governor at will, then the monetary policy could be shifting quicker than has been really the framework of the Fed Reserve has really been structured to be. And it could possibly impact inflation and other policy. And so that is why that case is so high stakes. And if there is not that check on presidential power, I think we will see serious consequences to economic policy.
Well, and it seems like nearly every case that is at the footsteps of these justices ends up having a broad impact on America. What do you see for the next year being the biggest cases?
I mean, I think we just talked about them. For this term, it's going to be birthright citizenship, because that will fundamentally change what it means to be an American citizen, right? I think also the tariff case, because how much power does the president enjoy economically, right? And how much checks are there on that executive power when Congress does also have the dual authority? And then I'm also looking at the Cook case, because if a president can fire somebody on the Fed Reserve kind of at will, and they also have to decide what for cause means. I mean, it's going to completely shift the constitutional landscape. And again, I am a legal beagle or legal eagle or nerd, so I understand where we're heading, and it could be very consequential.
Mike, what are you looking for?
Well, and just to piggyback on that, look, I